Good Thursday afternoon, everybody. I'm meteorologist Tim Pandages here with your tropical update. It is Thursday, September the 29th, 2022, and we're still talking about Ian, of course. It made landfall as a major Category 4 hurricane yesterday, about 24 hours ago from the recording of this video. Now it has weakened down to a tropical storm, but it has now cleared the east coast of Florida back over open water, so we do expect it to regain hurricane status as it now sets its sights on South Carolina for a secondary U.S. landfall, its third landfall overall. So what's next for Ian? Well, as I mentioned, it's pushed offshore now, so it's moving over warm waters of the Gulf Stream just off the Atlantic coast of Florida. It'll likely regain that hurricane status. They expect it to make it up to a Category 1 with sustained winds of at least 75 miles per hour. That secondary U.S. landfall occurs tomorrow afternoon along the South Carolina coastline. Right now, it's looking likely around the Charleston area. Flooding and strong winds are expected. Also storm surge along coastal areas, but I'm going to show you why I think the storm surge will actually be a little more amplified with this system as it makes landfall tomorrow and up leading to landfall too. So here's how it looks currently on radar and satellite presentation as of the 1 o'clock advisory from the Hurricane Center. 70-mile-per-hour wind, so it is a high-end tropical storm. It spent about 21 hours over Florida before re-entering the warm waters of the Atlantic Ocean and will likely begin a process of re-intensification. However, it's looking a little bit different. I'm going to talk about why in just a second, but look at the path of destruction it left behind. At landfall, the peak wind gust at Cape Coral was 140 miles per hour. 124 at Punta Gorda, Sarasota at 82. Even inland, Sebring, 78-mile-per-hour gusts reported there. And then along the Atlantic coast, the east coast of Florida near Cape Canaveral, Cocoa Beach, 67, New Smyrna Beach, 86. 81 miles per hour at Melbourne, and Daytona Beach at 76 as well. So windy across the entire state. Of course, windiest at landfall when it was at its strongest point of its lifetime so far. And behind it, leaving a whole line of very heavy rainfall along the I-4 corridor and points south of there. But notice the steep drop-off, the steep gradient here as you work farther to the south and southeast. All the heavy rain was situated to the northwest of that storm track, and that's because dry air was driving in behind it. And South Florida didn't really see very much rain at all from this system, maybe an inch or two in some spots, but spread out over a couple days. What you just saw there was a 24-hour rainfall total. So again, as I mentioned, it looks a little bit different than it did yesterday, not as symmetrical as it made landfall as a major hurricane. Now it's a high-end tropical storm and pretty much lopsided too. All of the moisture, all of the rainfall is situated to the northwest of that storm center right now. That's because it's got dry air that's working in behind it here. And as I switch it up and show you water vapor imagery, that tells us where the dry and moist air is. All of this rust color in the yellows and oranges is dry air being pulled down from the north and then pulled into the circulation, making it all the way into near the core of Ian right now. That's choking off the rain totals and will also work to disrupt its strengthening process. Add in wind shear that's been building on in. When it was a major Category 4, was easily able to fend off that wind shear. Now that it's a bit of a weaker storm, wind shear may have more of an input on its intensification process here. So yeah, it's got the warm water to work with, but now it's got the dry air and wind shear that's working against it as well. Hopefully it keeps it weak, but nonetheless, it's still got a lot of energy that it will disperse over a large area in the next 24 to 36, even 48 hours. Here's a look at radars right now, and this really tells the story of the dry air. Here's the center of Ian, again, now over the open waters just off the coast of Cape Canaveral and Melbourne. We've got the rain shield that continues to pour in Daytona Beach up to Jacksonville, where they've seen some of the heaviest totals so far. We'll add an additional 1, 2, 3 inches before the rain shield finally pushes offshore. But you can see all of that moisture wrapping around it. Hardly anything located to the south of the storm at this moment. So the storm track takes it off to the north, northeast, and eventually a northwest trajectory after it gets inland. But that track takes it right over the Gulf Stream. And what the Gulf Stream is basically a river of warm water originating in the Gulf of Mexico, moving along the coast of Florida and tracking all the way up along the east coast of the United States, transporting warm water. Now, why that's important for a tropical system, because remember we talked about Ian when it was strengthening up to a Category 4 storm, how upwelling, mixing up of the ocean waters would just replenish warm waters because that warm water went down to a great depth. Same kind of principle here, except what's going on is as the water's being upwelled, more and more warm water is being pulled in from that Gulf Stream to replace any warm water that's been cooled off from the heat transfer process that drives these systems here. So that should lead to a little bit of some intensification here, but as I just mentioned, the dry air and the wind shear working against it. Water temperatures at the surface, 87 degrees, certainly warm enough for tropical development. So here's the brand new forecast cone from the National Hurricane Center. It does show it now offshore, 70-mile-per-hour winds moving to the north-northeast at 9. By later on today, they expect it to get up to a hurricane again. Category 1, 75-mile-per-hour winds. It's offshore for another 12 hours or so. By 7 a.m. Friday morning, 75-mile-per-hour winds. Now it's about 50 miles offshore to the south of Charleston. Now, keep in mind, when you look at the wind flow around this counterclockwise, right? So the winds are coming onshore anywhere to the right on the east side of the storm and northeast. And the situation here with the South Carolina coastline and the trajectory of where it's going to move onshore means all this water is getting pulled onshore. Again, it's not as strong as it was when it moved onshore in Florida, but nonetheless, it'll pull water onshore and lead to some storm surge values in those areas that normally flood and are susceptible to storm surge. Then it builds inland, over land now, so it does rapidly weaken, drops down to a 50-mile-per-hour tropical storm by Friday evening, and works its way farther inland, becomes a remnant low tropical depression as all that moisture runs into the spine of the Appalachians. And when that happens, that does lead to prolific rain totals because it forces all of that air, that tropical moisture, to rise, condense, and precipitate, and basically wrings the atmosphere out like a sponge. So we're going to look at very high rain totals, all areas along into the east of the Appalachian spine. All right, let's look at storm surge now. Up to 6-foot storm surge values are expected in all the areas in yellow. Pretty much the majority of the South Carolina coastline has that potential. Really will depend on exactly where that landfall location happens, because anywhere to the east of that storm center will experience a storm surge. To the west, not so much. The winds will be blowing offshore at that point. Up to 7 feet in some of the areas in orange here out by Folly Beach, Isle of Palms. Maybe some areas in Charleston right along the bay there could experience that. Now, here's why I think it may be a little bit amplified, that storm surge risk, because we've got an area of high pressure that'll be building over New England. An area of low pressure, that's our tropical system. That's Ian. Now, this pressure gradient between the two, a mountain of air and a valley, leads to a steep drop-off. And that creates winds that will be stronger funneling in along the ocean front there through North and South Carolina, likely enhancing that storm surge threat in some of these areas. So there are storm surge warnings up for the entire South Carolina coastline, the Georgia coastline down to Jacksonville in Florida, and then storm surge watches all the way up through the Outer Banks and just south of Kill Devil Hills there. And then you see the Charleston area that could see some of the highest totals, again, dependent on the landfall location. Now, there's also hurricane warnings up for the South Carolina coastline. And in the orange here is tropical storm warnings that extend all the way inland to Charlotte, North Carolina, almost as far inland as Asheville, almost to the spine of the Appalachians. That's because the wind field is massive with Ian. Right now, tropical storm force winds of 39 miles per hour at least extend out 360 miles from the center of Ian to the north and east there. That's this massive lobe here of yellow. So that means tropical storm force winds have already reached the South Carolina, even parts of the North Carolina coastline. They extend out about 200 miles to the north and west, so moving inland over the Georgia coastline at this time. Watch this lobe as we go forward in time and jumping out to tomorrow past landfall. We see that tropical storm force winds could make it as far north as Raleigh, North Carolina, maybe into Charlotte, North Carolina, certainly over Wilmington, points near Columbia, and certainly over to Charleston as well. And then as the storm moves over land, that wind field will start to shrink as it loses its energy. So when does the tropical storm force winds arrive, and what's the chances of seeing them? Nearly certain. In fact, they're already arriving along the coastline of Georgia and into South Carolina. But by later on this evening, 8 p.m. or so, it's now north of Charleston. Myrtle Beach could see those winds arrive by early morning on Friday, 2 a.m. And by 8 a.m. on Friday, moving up towards Fayetteville, Columbia, New Bern in North Carolina, just south of Raleigh at that time as well. So we'll start to see those winds slowly build their way northwards. Again, the storm's moving rather slowly still at around 9 miles per hour. And as I mentioned, the atmosphere will be wrung out. Look at the amount of tropical moisture here. Rainfall totals locally 8 to 12 inches in some of these spots, and all of that rain spreading north and inland up through the Appalachians there. Asheville area could see 4, 5, 6 inches of rain. Same out towards Charlotte. A breezy day on Friday and a Saturday as well. All of that rain falling in a rather short amount of time means that there's a risk for flash flooding. In fact, there's 4 risk tiers. This red here is a 3 tier of 4, so almost the highest tier possible in these areas in red here that could see 2, 3, 4 inch an hour rainfall rates in some of these bands that could lead to some flash flooding. So that's the latest on Ian, looking towards a landfall on the South Carolina coastline about this time tomorrow, so it's got about another 18 to 24 hours over water, so likely as a low-end Category 1 hurricane at landfall time. Until next time, if you have any questions, I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and on Facebook. I'm also on TikTok at TimTalkWeather. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday.